All right, Tim, hit it.
Welcome to Chapter Connect. I'm your host, Dr. Tim Radke, Vice President for Chapters at the Explorers Club. Before we get started with today's program, I wanted to take a moment to say a few words. Many of us have seen the President's video report that just came out, and I want to thank Richard Weiss, our President, for including me in the report and introducing me to the members, especially the newer members who are probably not familiar with me at all. I do want to say that presentation was edited, and unfortunately, an important part of the presentation ended up on the cutting room floor. So I'd like to splice that back in, if I may. What I also added to the program was that I want to thank our program director, Ann Passer, for conceiving and producing Chapter Connect. This was totally her idea, and she deserves a lot of credit for all the work she does. Each week, she works tirelessly with our chapters to produce this show and bring it to you. I am just so thrilled to have been asked to be the host of this show and have a small part in its production. So thank you, Ann. And now we'll move on with our show. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you the Greater Piedmont chapter. Person leading off for this chapter will be Chapter Chair Emeritus John Hodge. John, welcome to Chapter Connect.
Tim, great to be here. Glad to have our chapter members along as well.
So how are you going to start off? You want to introduce your chapter, or what are you going to start with?
Okay, well, let's do that first. We've got Dr. Tim Mousseau, who's with us, and he's a professor at the University of South Carolina, as well as James Borton, who was our chapter chair, Dr. Jenny Pournelle and Dr. Jonathan Leader, who are both with the University of South Carolina, and then Badir Albadran from Basra will be on. Brian Helmuth, I understand, also a former member of our chapter who's now at Northeastern University, it will be presenting something briefly. And then David Brinkman will also present. And basically, we've got a number of former chapter chairs in our presentation today. And Tim, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of our chapter, if you're interested in that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, first, the chapter was founded in 1976, and there were two gentlemen from Boston, Horace Byrne and George Fulton, that came down to South Carolina, and they were consultants with the Department of Education here. Both were members of the Explorers Club, and they had an interest in forming a chapter. So they came to a critical mass, reached out to initially members that were in North Carolina, Tennessee, as well as South Carolina, and they formed a chapter, had their first meeting, really 76, 77, that got started. Another one of the founding members was a gentleman named Jim Jackson, who was actually sponsored to the club by Lowell Thomas, and he actually produced a series regarding Lowell Thomas as well, and that was broadcast a series on public television. And two of the really important, I think, early members of our chapter, and this is important because we see this influence today. One was Dr. John Vernberg, who came down from Duke to University of South Carolina to start the marine science program. That was in the 70s. And so we've seen a litany of marine scientists, oceanographers, people like that in our chapter. And it all started basically with John Vernberg, and he passed away some years ago, but it moves on through today. Another person was Alan Albright, who was one of the founding members too. Alan was an archaeologist at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology. And we also see, I would say, a cluster of fine archaeologists amongst our members. So we see a litany of marine scientists, oceanographers, people like that. So anyway, that's kind of we have I guess, a bimodal distribution in our chapter of member interest, but there are also other interests as well. Now, we cover a number of states. We originally were North Carolina, as I say, South Carolina, Tennessee. That was expanded to Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Bermuda. But at some point, the Atlanta chapter seceded from Greater Piedmont, and they have a wonderful chapter. We've got great friends over there, Harry Brooks, and when Alex Wallace was there as well, a number of other people that we get in touch with from time to time. And we meet monthly. Well, we did meet monthly until COVID started up. And then at that point, we started into Zoom meetings. And one of the things I want to say about chapters, when you have a Zoom meeting, we're in South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, and with that great, basically, territory that we have, it's hard for people to come to our meetings. And we have monthly luncheon meetings typically, but now we've started Zoom meetings. And that's a great opportunity because it allows members that don't live locally to participate and to be involved in the chapter. So we're really excited about kind of that expansion, thanks to the Zoom platform, or basically to kind of the virtual platforms that exist.
That's great. Yeah, I found the same thing myself. It's actually odd that, well, the virus is pushing us apart from one another. Technology is actually bringing us together. It's an interesting dichotomy. So who's up next?
Okay, well, why don't we start out? And I think I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And one more thing I'd like to bring up, though. One of our charter members, Horace Byrne, was a Sweeney medalist. And I need to read some of the kind of salutation when he received the Sweeney Medal, because this is really important for any chapter. And this is the end of the salutation. It says, Horace Byrne has made it abundantly clear that chapters are vital to the vital aspect of the Explorers Club. We recognize Horace for his outstanding contribution to this program and for his many achievements and educational activities consistent with the goals of the club. And that was actually part of the salutation when he was awarded the Sweeney Medal. And I think those words ring true today. So we'll start out. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Tim Mousseau. And Tim basically he's a biologist at the University of South Carolina. His career, I guess, has spent many years at Chernobyl, now most recently at Fukushima. And he's looked at the insects, birds, now mammals. Tim has been on a number of national publications. He's been on BBC, he's been New York Times, he's been on 60 Minutes, he's been in The Economist, on and on. And Tim's program this evening is Radiation Effects in Chernobyl. What did the mammals say? So I'll turn it over to Dr. Tim Mousseau.
All right, well, thanks very much. It really is great to be sharing the stage with you folks here tonight and getting to meet a few new people. I have no idea how many people are watching on Facebook, but hopefully there's more than a couple. And, obviously we don't have time to talk a whole lot about any one thing that we're doing, but I was going to share with you guys let's see here, a PowerPoint with just a few things going on in my lab, and we'll see if we can get this to do the audio video as well. And let's see if we got some sound effects here. There you go. Can you guys hear that? Anyway, so the topic for today, the title I gave was this: wildlife in Chernobyl. What do the mammals say? And it's kind of a hot topic in the radioecology field, and because there's a variety of opinions on the topic. You'd think that a scientific issue, there wouldn't be so many opinions, but we've learned a lot the last 6 months about how opinionated even science can get. And so anyway, we've devoted the last 20 years or so looking at the wildlife of Chernobyl. Started with Chernobyl, moved on to Fukushima, and more recently we've gotten into atomic bomb test sites around the world. And just by way of introduction, and really the key point I want to make today to this audience is that don't believe the television documentaries that suggest that the Chernobyl zone's an Eden for wildlife. These claims are vastly exaggerated. They're based on kind of a manipulation of the perspective on the issue, and the avoidance of the central issue of whether or not radiation has some significant impact on these critters. Our group has made more than 60 expeditions to the Chernobyl zone since 2000. We've looked at microbes, plants, insects, birds, and mammals, as John mentioned. We've published a whole bunch over the years. And most recently, the last few years, we've set up a whole network of cameras, motion activated cameras all the way around the zone, mostly to capture the mammal behavior, and that's been really kind of interesting. And sort of the bottom line of this body of work is that where it's radioactive, the organisms aren't doing so well. and in many different respects, starting with their DNA and going all the way up to their fertility and population and community effects as well. So, so anyway, don't listen to what the fox says, not what the fake news says. But anyway, camera traps. They're great now. The new ones, the latest editions, have cellular networks. And so you don't even have to go out to the field to download the data, especially if you have a solar panel running it. And so we've managed to collect about 10 million images over the last 5 or 6 years from around the world, but mostly in Chernobyl. And you know, the quality of the images are not exactly publication quality, but they're certainly good enough to identify the critter in the image. And as you can see, our star of our show are the foxes of Chernobyl. There's also foxes in Japan. This is actually one from Fukushima. And recently, some of my students who are in computer science have developed an artificial intelligence network that will allow us to, that is allowing us to screen through the millions of photos we generate to actually identify the species and give us counts automatically. And this has really made life a whole lot easier. Here's a lynx in Chernobyl. Again, you know, so it is true that 30 years ago, there were no lynx in Chernobyl. There were no bears, and it's because it was a relatively densely populated area, mostly agricultural, and anything like a lynx or a bear was hunted and killed, or a wolf for that matter. But these days, you know, the odd straggler comes through. In Fukushima here, we've seen one bear in, you know, 6 years or so, but it was a real bear, and as you can see from these photos, and so, you know, occasionally we see interesting things. Chernobyl. Here's a photo of the Przewalski's horse, one of these highly endangered Mongolian horses that was the progenitor to the domestic horse. And they're really interesting to watch. All sorts of very primitive horse behavior, and they're, yeah, obviously handsome beasts. Lots, you know, quite a few of these guys roaming around Chernobyl as well. Again, very, very interesting. This thing is, these critters are enormous, and there are, again, yeah, it's true, there are more moose in the Chernobyl zone than in the surrounding areas because there's no hunting. But in the areas of high radiation, they're not doing so well. In fact, most of them avoid the most contaminated areas in some way or another. But it still makes, you know, getting these kinds of images is just a whole lot of fun to work with. We have about, you know, between 15 and 20 undergraduate students in the lab at any one time, helping us to process the hundreds of thousands of images that are generated every month. But they, and you know, some of the best and brightest students that I've ever had in my lab, and they really enjoy sorting through all of this, and we're gaining lots and lots of interesting insights. The most recent mammal to join our little menagerie, as it were, are feral dogs. We started with the feral dogs of Chernobyl. We started up an NGO, in fact, this, my hat here, Visiting Veterinarians International. So I'm collaborating with a group of veterinarians, collaborating with an NGO in Chernobyl, in Ukraine. Most of the effort is to catch these feral dogs and spay, neuter, and vaccinate them. So we're mostly interested in the welfare of these animals. But at the same time, we're managing to get samples of their blood, samples of their poop and saliva to do interesting genetic analyses. And so we've actually started up a collaboration with the NIH, the Genome Research lab at the NIH, which has long been interested in dogs because they're actually a great model for human disease, and a whole lot of other things. So NIH has been thrilled that we've been going around the world collecting DNA from all these feral dogs, and they're doing all of the genomic sequencing for us. We also have an industrial partner, QIAGEN, which is perhaps one of the largest you know, biotech molecular supply company in the world. They keep amalgamating with other companies, and they're supporting the genomics on the microbiome of the guts of these animals. So this is again been incredibly exciting. Every year it gets bigger and better, and you know, I'm really grateful to the Explorers Club for having supported some of the work that we're doing in spirit, if not elsewise. The other aspect of, you know, the work that we're doing is that it is it's a magnet. It's just an incredible magnet for bright young talent. And so a couple of years ago in Chernobyl, we had 5 undergraduates from USC come help us collect samples, and they had a fabulous time. 3 of them gone on to vet school. One of them's doing a PhD with me at the NIH lab doing the genomics, and so it's just been an incredible vehicle for mentorship and training for these students as well. And who doesn't love puppies, right? So and here's a shot of one of our one of our partners. This is Lucas Hickson in the background, who's runs one of the NGOs, CFF, and one of our subjects here, wild dog of Chernobyl. They're not so wild in some areas because they get fed by the tourists, but they are roaming free and getting exposed to all the contaminants in the area. And the second to last little project that we're working on, we got it started this past January, just before COVID hit. We went to the Marshall Islands, and as most of you know, the U.S. and many other countries bombed the living daylights out of various places around the world in the 40s, 50s, and 60s primarily. A couple places are still doing it, but we bombed the living daylights out of the Marshall Islands. Some of the largest bombs, nuclear bombs ever made were dropped onto the Marshall Islands. And there's still large amounts of radioactive contamination in these areas. They're almost impossible to get to for a number of reasons, but almost all of them have some people. And wherever there's people, of course, there's dogs and a few cats too, Jenny. And although we're focusing on dogs for the moment, and they're quasi-feral. They're sort of half pet, half feral, and they're living in this contaminated area. And so hopefully we'll learn a lot about what the effects of radiation are from looking at these animals, in particular the dogs from around the world. The last project, the last slide here, is my most recent project, which is very cool, very exciting for me at least, and it allows me to merge my interest in Chernobyl radiation research with my interest in space radiation. And turns out that, as you've probably all heard, NASA, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and several other people really do want to get to Mars with people. They want to, have manned missions to Mars. They want to set up and established permanent settlements there, and they're going to have to grow plants, and they're going to have to grow plants and survive themselves, obviously, under very, very, very radioactive conditions. What most people don't realize is that the Earth is we're the only reason we're here is because of a couple of really unique features. One, of course, is all of the oxygen in the atmosphere, the ozone layer, which is blocking a lot of the radiation, but also the magnetosphere. And again, I'm not an astronomer. Maybe John Hodge can help us here. I'm not sure how many planets out there have the equivalent of a magnetosphere, but a magnetosphere is what is necessary to deflect all of the cosmic radiation. Without that, we would be toast. And so anyway, out in space, Mars, the radiation levels are really high. So hopefully we're going to mine the biodiversity, the genetic diversity in Chernobyl plants, where they've been living for 30 years plus under highly radioactive conditions. We're going to mine that diversity for mechanisms of resistance to the radiation that may be incorporated into crop plants later. It certainly sounds very cool. I'm thrilled to be able to participate, although the COVID thing has really dampened the opportunities a little bit, but we're moving forward. And I think that's all I had to say for now. So let me see, how do I get out of here?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, hopefully, I hope I didn't go over time too much there.
Not a problem. Our next speaker is James Borton. He is the Greater Piedmont Chapter Chair. James is an environmental journalist. He's a non-resident fellow at the Tufts University Science Diplomacy Center. And he's also quite knowledgeable on issues involving the South China Sea, the ecology and marine science in that area. And James, we'll turn it over to you. Citizen Science on the Mekong River. Students use smartphones to document environmental challenges.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Let me begin by saying what a privilege it is to be associated with the Explorers Club, and as the Greater Piedmont Chapter Chair, we really draw upon right here at our footsteps the great resources at the University of South Carolina, as we've seen this evening already with Dr. Mousseau's presentation. But let me draw you right into where I have been focused for the last 30 years, which is the new Vietnam, and specifically the Mekong Delta. In fact, I have been traversing up and down that Mekong for many, many years. Along the way, we've discovered a new generation of young Vietnamese. In fact, in a country of 100 million, 50% of those are under the age of 35, and they're all with their smartphones and their internet savvy. They're much more connected than I am, in fact. But what I've discovered in the time spent in the Mekong Delta, and perhaps we'll bring up some of those slides momentarily, and we'll go to the next one, please. What I've discovered in looking at the Mekong Delta, which is really the rice bowl for Vietnam. That is, not only are there 20 million citizens there, but it is indeed the fertile area, once was, that feeds the entire country. And at one point they were exporting their rice. But things have changed dramatically from the unchecked fast speed of industrialization that's taken place in the country. And along with that has come, of course, pollution, namely water pollution. The climate change has contributed to the droughts, the ongoing floods, and increasing levels of ocean acidification. So sea level rise, it comes into the rice paddies, creating severe food security problems for the nation. And to compound matters, what I have also witnessed upstream, China has been constructing a series of dams, which is creating many, many sedimentation issues. We go to the next slide, you'll see that what I've attempted to do in meeting with young scientists at Canto University in Canto, Vietnam, a university that has about 43,000 students, is that many of those students are engaged in environmental science issues. So we decided to create a series of workshops. Let's call them citizen science workshops. I think as a former adjunct, I always have to define my terms. So you can see here that really it involves volunteers, and non-professionals, if you wish, but working side by side with the scientists from Canto University. But it's really emboldening more of the local farmers to take control of some of the myriad of environmental issues they're facing. You go to the next slide. What I've done here is really map out how through the internet and through smartphones, we're seeing much more of what I call digital conservation efforts, namely through what participatory governance. I don't need to remind anyone that there is a single party, the Communist Party, that operates and pushes down policy as opposed to bottom up, a participatory effect. But what we're seeing is this engagement of young Vietnamese students with their smartphones in hand, all of them very active environmentalists. We go to the next slide. What I've done is kind of examine how the smartphone converging with the kind of participatory, if you wish, local provincial politics is at an intersection. There's much more communication, and again, that includes through social media, but more to the point addressing science, and that's why we're here tonight, is the data integration that's taking place where data is being retrieved and documented through their smartphone application. We go to the next slide. You're actually looking at, these are young students from Canto University, all of them environmental science majors. And indeed, they're working with the local farmers, empowering, educating them, and trying to produce right there in the field some environmental training workshops. They're teaching the local farmers how to use these available new technologies, which are free apps on their smartphones. And indeed, the farmers are beginning to embrace this technology. They do have access to the smartphones. So they're beginning to introduce what I would call climate resilient polyculture models. Instead of having just one crop, rice, of course, they're going to their ponds and raising shrimp, raising fish, and indeed beginning to diversify as they face potential food security problems. Let's go to the next slide. And so in this diagram, I'm presenting how a different kind of engagement is taking place from these, if you wish, student volunteer citizen science, how they're taking their knowledge, science information, of course, working closely with their professors, and impacting in terms of a new kind of conversation with the decision makers at the provincial level. So in effect, what we're seeing is, to be clear, the democratization of science and science flow of information through their smartphone. We go to the next slide, we'll maybe see a little bit more of that. In effect, these student volunteers, or let's call them, I'd call them citizen scientists, are developing kind of community capacity. And they're raising awareness for really smart agricultural production, which is much needed in the country. And they're providing this training on the use of the smartphone science apps. And we're going to get to some of those apps in a minute. But they're educating the local farmers towards these climate resilient developmental models. And I can assure you, even though at times in the last couple of years, Hanoi, their internet gatekeepers, have come down very severely on Facebook and some social media because of fake news, at the highest level, they have given us, that is the Mekong Environment Forum, an NGO set up at Kanto University, the green light to, if you wish, not only train more students in citizen science, but to make sure that the documentation is achieved through their smartphone, and they're placing this information on social media. So it's a major breakthrough. So in effect, the field work is teaching the farmers how to monitor their water quality, address the negative wastewater impact, and if you wish, avoid continuing contamination. We go to the next slide. We're all familiar with these social networking sites, but in the case of the Vietnamese young people, they're beginning to use, Flickr, Facebook, Instagram for documentation of environmental conditions and issues. In the next slide, we'll see how I've kind of enumerated some of the models where the farmers are beginning to diversify their crops, where, as I mentioned, instead of depending exclusively on their rice paddy, which unfortunately with the sea level rise is now being flooded with salt water, that does not help grow rice. We know that. So using these ponds, they're growing crops of seagrass, fish, crab, and of course shrimp. So what it is also doing, it's encouraging the farmers to restore the mangrove cover in the shrimp ponds. In the past, they had been destruction. There had been too much wanton destruction of the mangroves. So it's, in effect, the citizen science, that young Vietnamese trained there at the university, is increasing the awareness level, educating the local farmer about the local ecosystem's ability to absorb waste, offer natural food, shelter for the marine species, the shrimps, the fish, the crabs. So I think these workshops, based on we've had, and over the last 3 years in setting up this NGO, we've had over close to 8 or 10 workshops. Some of them have been 2-day programs, but it's field-based learning, and it's helping provide ecological information. Next slide. And I decided for presentation purposes, most of us are familiar with a lot of the free downloadable science apps, but there's so many out there. And some of them that I wanted to identify, I didn't actually place on here because they deal with water models, water monitoring systems, if you wish. But there are opportunities for us to kind of educate the local farmer how to use a smartphone and downloading some of the water monitoring science apps that are freely available. We can scan through this and go to the next slide. I think there's several here. Okay. Some of those are not completely relevant to this idea of water modeling, but it gets us into at least the idea that there's an availability of many science apps that are accessible for the farmer. And what the students are doing then is through their documentation is using Facebook to post their stories, to talk about the science, if you wish, that they're applying there in the Delta, and in effect, also creating a shared database so that our friends, their friends in Hanoi in the north, where the Red River Delta is, which unfortunately has experienced the same kind of potential food security issues, are sharing information. And so this is becoming kind of a lightning rod for, again, I can't overstate this enough as both a journalist and a reporter, this kind of democratization of science information that is indeed helping address a myriad of environmental issues. And our last slide, next slide. These are some of these, I love these images of the Mekong Delta. It is indeed all about life. It's all about food. And indeed, the Delta, the Mekong River, well, it is called appropriately the mother of all rivers. And so it is the artery for life, and particularly for the downstream country of Vietnam. I'm just really so impressed with the energy, the enthusiasm, the intellect of the young students that I have met there at Kanto University. I can tell you, not only are they far more savvy about the internet and apps and applications, if you wish, they are also bilingual. They're speaking English. English is the lingua franca, and so there is nothing lost in translation. So I'm glad to present this the work that we've been doing there in the Mekong Delta. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Our next set of speakers, Dr. Jennifer Pournelle, Dr. Jonathan Leader, Dr. Badir Albadran, also joined with Brian Helmuth and John Fisher, will speak about Mesopotamian conversations, our past and future explorations in Edin. And let me say that, first off, that Dr. Pournelle is a research professor at the University of South Carolina in the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences. And her specialization is landscape archaeology, wetlands and marsh cultural ecology, sustainability in the urban environment, and also Middle Eastern climate change and civilizations. Dr. Jonathan Leader is a South Carolina state archaeologist. And I have to tell you, a visit to his office is like walking into a museum, and Jonathan's perspective is just extremely broad. And it's always a pleasure. Every time I get to his office, I learn 3 or 4 new things. And he's, his interests are far and wide. And so you guys take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me get the slides going. So I called this Mesopotamian Conversations because I want to make this little presentation less about a particular thing we discover, but more about the process of exploration. Like James in Vietnam or Tim in the Ukraine, I've spent a lot of time, decades in the Middle East. And I want to talk about what exploration has meant, how it has happened, and what it has become in these times of COVID. In Mesopotamia, speaking of Edin, speaking of Chernobyl not being Eden for mammals, this really is Eden. That is the biblical Garden of Eden was right there. It is Meso, the Potamia, the 2 rivers, the original mother of all rivers. It is said that if you drink from the Euphrates, you will always return. And I first drank from the Euphrates, well, not literally, or I probably wouldn't still be alive, but probably in the early 90s up in southeastern Turkey. It's an area, as you can see from this map, that has been known to every empire that has ever risen and fallen in the old world. And so where do you explore? How do you explore Mesopotamia? It's been explored by everybody. Well, you explore it through time. This is where the home of the world's oldest cities. This is where, in this picture, I'm standing on top of the ziggurat of Ur, a relative newcomer. The reeds sticking out of these layers of mud brick have been dated to 2200 BC. That means that was about 2,000 years after the city was founded, this ziggurat was built. That's deep time. Everything you see in this picture was human-made. Everything. It's all denuded mud brick as far as the eye can see. And Tim will understand this. It's a matter of people over thousands of years converted every single resource into something for humans, and then into humans, and then there was literally nothing left as they moved on. So our exploration, if you will, didn't start with us. It started with Dr. Badir Albadran, he's pictured here in gray, who in 2008, almost actually while the civil war in Iraq was still going on, but winding down, he understood that to be part of the world, he had to reach out of the world. He would explore, if you will, us. He wanted to explore what was happening in research outside of this little tiny patch of land. And it is tiny. From our point of view, it's the equivalent of traveling from, say, Myrtle Beach to Hilton Head. Okay, it's not a very big area. And so he set up the Geology of Mesopotamia, this website that is in English, reaching out, just seeing who'd respond. And this is his comment about this. Now, I apologize it can't be here with us, but it's between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning where he is now.
Of Mesopotamia site in 2008 in order to inform researchers from the rest of the world about the geological nature of the southern part of Mesopotamia, as well with the hope of participating with them in detailed studies of the region to complete the picture of the geological history and geological situation, especially during the Quaternary period.
So as you heard in there, especially during the Quaternary, here's a geologist who wants to reach back way beyond when the cities started to when, well, anything at all started down there. So how do you do that? How do you start exploring what is still arguably a war zone? Well, you get on the chicken bus, okay? We found a fellow, Jeff Hahn, who had been doing overland tours from London to India, riding 12 passenger vans since 1972, and he's still doing them. So when nobody could go there, he could, and we did too. That's our stuff up on top of the bus. And once we got into the chicken bus, we traveled all the way from Baghdad, where the university was left looking like this, down to Uruk, that picture that you just saw. And along the way, we made the obligatory stop at the marshes. And on this trip, we realized that what was an exploration for us was actually still, or again, an exploration for people who lived there. They hadn't been able to go out into these marshlands for years at this point. So it required them reaching out to us and us connecting back for everybody to enter our delta, Jim. That is the Tigris-Euphrates Delta. So we finally made it to the University of Basra, and lo and behold, where was our first shop? Well, the tuck shop, you know, where the students hang out and get all of their get all of their treats. We loaded up our pockets with chocolate, and our next move, there we were, dressed for the chicken bus, was we were shocked to discover was to meet the chancellor of the university, because he was part of Badir. This is Badir's intellectual community that felt that the most important thing they could do was reach out and help us come in. They didn't know who we were, but they figured it was worth a shot. By the way, see us wearing headscarves here, that almost got us into trouble. At the university, we were being polite. We all put on, see, I have one here. We all put one on, okay, because we thought we should. And people were glowering at us as we walked through the hallway. It's glowering. We thought, oh no, Americans here in Iraq, it's going to be horrible. And finally, the chancellor's secretary looked at us and said, "You, why are you wearing that? Did he tell you to wear that?" Pointing to the chancellor. And we said, "No, we thought we were just being polite." And they said, "Where are you from?" I said, "We're Americans," thinking, okay, here's where it all ends. She said, "Oh, the way you had it on your head, we thought you were Iranians. We didn't want them in our university." So that was our introduction to the new world, and Badir can tell you what happened next.
It started between Geneva, Pournelle, and me in 2010, and the beginning was from the supervising a master's thesis, followed by 3 master's theses. As a result of this fruitful cooperation, a number of published papers as well as 2 books.
Now, I should mention that the thesis he's referring to was by a woman named Nagam Daish Al-Rawi, and she is now a member of the staff and faculty there. But she's representative of the student body there. 50% of the student body were women. We never expected to find that. I wish we could find that ratio with some universities. So that little start, me meeting Badir, us agreeing to sponsor a student, led to much bigger commitments between our 2 universities.
My name is Alan Miller, and for 6 years, I was the Vice Provost in charge of International Affairs at the University of South Carolina. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of relationships in international affairs. Universities build relationships with other institutions one at a time. They do it primarily through faculty interactions. People get to know each other, people go on the ground, they work with each other, and out of that, develop relationships. From those relationships come joint research projects. From those research projects, people start exchanging students along with data. And this is essentially how we grew our extraordinary program for Iraqi PhDs at the University of South Carolina, where we had over 70 Iraqi PhD students, most of whom received their PhDs or soon will, the vast majority. But if Jenny Pournelle had not developed relationships on the ground in Basra and elsewhere in Iraq, this would have never happened. So we like to think that everything can be done through websites, through email. But the fact of the matter is the foundation of university international collaboration is relationships. And those relationships are built between people. They require time and investment. And I could cite you many examples, but one of the best, in fact, is our Iraqi PhD program.
Now, he mentions the Iraqi PhD program. Those 70 who came here were 70 of over 400 that came to American universities. And that all started at that one meeting in the chancellor's office. They came fully funded, not one penny of US tax dollars was spent on them. And they have to return, and they have returned to their home country. So we now have a network, not of 1 or 2 people, but of 70 people that we have direct contact with across many fields. But that hadn't happened yet. So if you want to go do some work, say in southern Iraq, say along the rivers, say you're just an archaeologist and you don't really, who are you going to call? Well, put me in touch with some explorers, and you're going to meet a couple of them in this video. Some of you will recognize them. See this guy? He's our starfish engineer, editor of Wreck Diving Magazine, publisher. Here's Badir. I'm watching a boat, but this is John Fisher, who you'll see in a minute. And I'm still watching the boat, passing over a couple of other colleagues. And this is George Bell. And without Joe Porter and George Bell's support, the next phase would not have happened. Now, this wasn't direct support from the Explorers Club in the sense of a grant. It was direct support from explorers who had key technical skills that were essential to our next project. When we got there on that trip up the river, we had a lot of time while the river was just going along. We had a lot of time to talk to folks and ask what it was they wanted. And we were shocked. They didn't want money. Sorry, this is doing it all in Amazonian. They didn't want money. They wanted training. And what did they want training in? Well, among other things, ground penetrating radar and other things useful to geology. And at this point, I hand over to John Leader, who can talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Yeah, this was a, if we can back up one more time. Jenny, can you back me up?
Yep.
Thank you. One more time. So what we ended up with was this great opportunity. People were doing the work, but they needed to make sure they actually understood the equipment. Understand, getting equipment into a rock, not easy to do. Very hard to get through things. Lots of paperwork, as you'd expect. The money is difficult to come by, but they did it. And in point of fact, I helped set it up with Jenny and everybody else. And we brought in now, John Fisher will talk about his part in a moment with his GPS set, but I need to tell you, just because it's kind of funny, to get some of that equipment in, including the GPS materials and the antenna and the stadia rods for it. Don't stop me. Back me up, please. We couldn't figure out how to get it on the plane. So strangely enough, I ended up with a military sniper rifle, a hard case, took it all apart, put it in there, took it down to the airport, and they didn't even bat an eye. It just went through and it shows up in a rock, this military case, walking it through the airport and out, full of this stuff. They asked me, what's in it? I said, a GPS unit. I said, great. They didn't even look. Off we went. Can't make these stories up. What you're looking at there is a Monolith GPR. It has the setup for the GPS system attached to it. Nowadays, we would use a multiple imaging radar array, which would be 8 of them across, all at the same time, giving a 3D of the ground. But at the time period we're doing this in 2014, we didn't have that capability that was available to us. It was available to others, but not to us. So we brought in this equipment, they had it, and we started running it, trained everybody up on it, and we took it out in the field. It was great. They were incredible. They covered kilometers by pushing that cart across the ground. They actually found an actual hidden hamlet. They had the radiogram. We're sitting down at the house in the evening, and one of the faculty came over and we're eating kebabs and talking and drinking tea. And he says, what do you think of this? And he brings up this radiogram, which is the drawing that radars make. And I'm looking and saying, holy cow, that's a tell. You can see the top of it and it goes down. And there's the shield wall that protects the town. And he said, oh, and I said, well, wait a second. That's 35 feet deep. I mean, Jenny wasn't kidding. It is such an incredibly long period of time there. And so much mud brick has eroded and simply built up that this ancient hamlet was 30 feet under the ground, but still fully visible to the radar. And what we see here is faculty members from the University of Basra Geology Department, including one of the female faculty members, and she's actually running the equipment. And we're at an Abbasid site just outside of Basra, doing some training there to make sure everybody understands what's going on before we bring the students in. But it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. The strength of these people to get the work done, the desire to get it done, the need to get these things done and to control the destiny of their patrimony, of their land, of their area is second to none. And it's all about the relationship. I've built labs in Africa, I've built labs in South America, I've done work in those places as well as many explorers have. But every place you go, what you end up doing is not doing it yourself. You go, you train the people, you work with them, and you turn them loose, and they ask you questions, and you come back in and you play together well with the toys. And the next thing you know, you've got solid colleagues, tremendous collaboration, and off you go, and the world is your oyster. And I can't say enough about the folks in Iraq. They were tremendous. And at that time, if you remember, there were bad things happening in the north, but these folks were focused, they were on it. They were there for each other, regardless of anybody's background, and they were there for their students at such a high level. I wish I could say the same thing for here. And for some of the people I can, to be fair. But it was astonishing. They were feeding some students. They were helping students. It was amazing. So that's enough for me. What I'd like to do is turn this over now to John Fisher, who will tell you all about his work there and how that led to his career. Jenny, can you bring it back? Yeah, there you go. Okay, John, you're up.
All right. So actually, it was great. I joined the team. My first year was actually, like Jenny was saying, with the Wreck Diving magazine. And we were really there to kind of map some things, get some feet on the ground. National Geographic was nice enough to sponsor some things. And we got to hook up with Dr. Badir and several of his colleagues. And so what turned into, you know, basically a team full of people who had their own little niche. I had a diving background, and I also had a background with unexploded ordnance. So one of the things that we did is everybody brought this to the table, and they said, we're going to help cross-train one another. And then that's also going to provide sustainability on the ground. Well, then you find out, well, everybody kind of has a background there. And so you can all teach one another and you can hit the ground running. And you have this wonderful team from the University of Basra that's bringing their students along as well. And they just want to get out there. They absolutely eat up everything. I mean, it's like the perfect audience. They eat up everything that they can take in. And you make these lifelong friendships of people who are really passionate about their careers and really passionate about what's going on at home for them. And like Jenny said, we actually had a lot of interactions where we were going out and interacting with the Maghreb, the marsh Arabs. And basically the city people were so scared to death of interacting with them that they were freaking out when we were going out into the marshes. And, you know, they figured out, oh, these guys are just like, it might as well be my cousin down the street. And this was, you know, and everything along. And it just really, like, the connection was so strong. So when we went back with John and we did the GPR training, part of that was to kind of show what can you guys utilize that's free on the market, such as like Google Earth and things like that, and use that to help back your science. Because as they have the finances in some ways, but they might not have the connection or the means or the licenses or whatever you might have. So I was able to train them how to use a Trimble GPS to get sub-meter accuracy, and to use Google Earth, and, you know, show them you can use all this free software, because they were already doing the work. They already knew where the stuff, you know, the things that they needed to map were and everything else. We were just adding to it. But that also, those connections extended well beyond, and I actually ended up going to University College London, Qatar, thanks to Jenny and some of her colleagues that had worked together, and doing a master's in Arab and Islamic and pre-Islamic archaeology. And that just expanded. It took off. We basically, we were going to start doing more and more work in southeastern Iraq. We linked up with the museum there. I stayed in touch with several of the people who are the professors in these photos. And I mean, they have just supported their kids through everything, even without pay, and just keeping that connection. It just opened up all sorts of doors. And just seeing the way that they fostered this, and then also us exchanging information, figuring out what we can do with one another, it just continued to grow. And so if I can share my screen, I'd like to show you kind of where I came from after this. If you'll close yours, Jenny, real quick, just so I can pop photos up. I don't think it will. It's okay. I don't need to. But going from, there we go. Let's do this. Sorry about that. And so going from like where you see here, we were with the team in Iraq, and John and I, we went to a really well-known geological site. It's a salt diaper, Jebel al-Sanam, and they got to take their students out to the site. We got to map a number of features, so we got to train them on the ground, and then they're teaching us about everything they've done with geology, stuff that we think that we're exploring for the first time or doing whatever, and we're helping them map this, but they've been doing it all along. And so it's just fascinating for them to share this information, and that grew into continued sharing of information, which grew into attending conferences with one another, presenting data that people were like, oh my gosh, we didn't even know this was going on. It's like, no, it didn't end. It's been going on for decades. And so, you know, Jenny fostered that, and Dr. Badir fostered that. And like we said, my career took off. So here I am, and we're with several of the students. You see Dr. Badir and John up there, and some of the colleagues from University of Basra are still teaching. And then we moved into University College London, and I took those skills to Kazakhstan. And this is a pre-Islamic site. And I mean, you have all different nationalities there. And we did the exact same thing. We linked up with the Kazakhs. We did a lot of cross training that developed into a multiple year project. And it's the same idea. It's the exact same concepts and teamwork just continued on. And I couldn't be where I'm at now without all this. And that basically, to close out with my quick little bit, moved into us, John Leader, myself, and University College London, where I went, and Jenny, working on a marshland fort site. It's a sandbar in Charleston that was a War of 1812 fort that was sealed up and has not been excavated until we started a couple of years ago with the relationships that we had from University College London and now several Charleston schools to start teaching kids how to excavate on a site that is at risk and, you know, is probably going to be gone in a few decades. And so, you know, that's several students coming from there. And the skills that they got from this. I mean, the things that I learned from Iraq about what kids can learn, that they are tangible skills in the field, we applied there. And so now this is stuff that they're taking and getting jobs with. And it's the exact same stuff. And this would not have been possible without learning from my colleagues in Iraq and learning how to do this that are marketable skills for students. This is what the fort was actually one of the first places to house prisoners during the Civil War. Those are basically some cannons from the inside. But here we are as we started excavating, and that's one of the very first trenches ever opened. And this was only a couple of years ago. And now we've got a sustainable project where we're bringing multiple international students in, and hopefully I can have some Iraqi friends. I've even got a Syrian friend from school now that lives in Charleston. So it's just really, really grown. And the relationships that we've gotten and the education and everything else that I got from working with my Iraqi colleagues just blossomed everything, just took off my career. And also we're continuing to help one another grow. So I'll hand it back to you, Judy. One sec.
Okay.
Need to unmute, Jen.
You have to unmute.
Kenny, are you there?
Sorry, I was getting competing unmute buttons, and everyone I clicked asked me to click another one. So I've shown how this morphed into things that have engaged multiple people now in South Carolina across the world. But it's not just that. Other explorers like Brian Helmuth here, I took along as well. And that moved us into entirely new areas, less concerned with the past and far more concerned with the immediate present and future. And I'll let Brian speak for himself here.
Hi, I'm Brian Helmuth, a professor at Northeastern University and a 2005 fellow with the Leopold Leadership Program. I want to show you a few images of my most recent trip to southern Iraq, where with the help of the U.S. Department of State, I was able to meet with a diverse range of stakeholders, all concerned with the impacts of climate change and water scarcity in the region. Iraq is home to some of the most ancient cultures on Earth, including a people called the Marsh Arabs, who are believed to be the most direct descendants of the ancient Sumerians. For well over 5,000 years, the Marsh Arabs, who depended on the local salt marsh environment, built their houses, feed their water buffalo, and supply the fish and birds that they hunt. All of that changed in 1993 when, in a horrific example of mass genocide, Saddam Hussein drained the marshes and set them on fire. 90% of the marshes were destroyed, and now much still looks like this. Now, following a restoration program spearheaded by Nature Iraq, the marshes are starting to come back and families are returning. UNESCO has also designated a portion of the marsh as a World Heritage Site. We had an opportunity to visit the UNESCO site in Tukar and to meet some of the residents. In this picture, I'm with faculty from the University of Basra, people from the NGO Nature Iraq, and representatives from Basra Oil and Gas, alongside some of the Marsh Arab children we met. For several hours, we toured the marshes with local guides familiar with the hidden pathways in the reeds, which in many cases were over 4 meters high. It wasn't that much of a stretch to imagine what this environment must have looked like many thousands of years ago. And in the end, we were treated to a traditional meal of river carp, flavored with pomegranate, served in a traditional mudif, a large meeting hall made entirely of reeds. This really was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life, and I truly look forward to my next trip back to this really fascinating country.
I have to say, I just want to share one thing that Brian told me. I'm trying to make this go away, but it won't. So after all of that training and all of that cooperation and all of that effort, what then is going to happen for the future? Where are we going to go from here, and how are we going to do it? We've got people now sinking cores to examine the deep past, and now they're doing that on the behalf of not just our university, but several other universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, and for the Geological Survey of Iraq. They've gone 3 meters, then 5 meters, then deeper, and of course managed to haul the things back out of the ground. Badir himself is retired, but he's not done. In fact, he's been engaged to set up a new department of archaeology and geoarchaeology at private universities in Iraq. Gives him even more flexibility towards the future. So not only have we not stopped collecting, in fact, his students on the ground are still collecting. And not only have we not stopped doing research, in fact, he's the explorer now. We're at home. He sends us data. He sends us samples, and life goes on. Because for them, COVID is yet one more minor distraction. They've been in lockdown for the better part of 2 decades. They're more than happy to go out and collect a sample or two to help us continue to explore the deep past. So I want to thank you all for your time, and hope that the contact info at the end of the slide presentation gets shared.
Jenny, thank you very much. That was excellent. Thanks to both John Fisher, Jonathan Leader, and to you and Brian Helmuth as well, and also to Badir for a fantastic program. One of the things I want to emphasize this evening, there are 2 overarching themes before we finish our last two programs, 2 speakers. One, of course, is the fact that relationships are very important in exploration. And I think from the talk so far, you really begin to understand that part of the role of the Explorers Club and being explorers is to develop relationships with the local people, develop relationships with fellow explorers. That's very important. And the other thing is, as we segue from looking at studies and looking at expeditions in exotic places, now we're going to come close to home, because in the age of COVID, what happens is we can't get out and go to places we used to, and everybody wants to climb a mountain somewhere far away or dive on a reef somewhere. But in COVID, that's becoming increasingly difficult. So what we want to encourage other members of the club to do is to look locally. And so the last 2 presentations will focus on basic local expeditions, if you will, which brings us to David Brinkman, who's a former chapter chair of the club. David is a computer engineer by profession and training, but he's also quite an archaeologist by his experience and by really his painstaking time spent performing historical and local archaeological studies. And so his presentation this evening is exploring archaeology, finding the lost cities, forts, and bridges, old and new generations. And you'll see again here, relationships are very important. So take it away, David.
Okay, thank you, John. And like John said, we've heard a lot of things from around the world, distant places. This 6.5-minute video here are going to be 3 archaeological projects that were all done within a 2-mile radius of the dead center of Columbia, South Carolina. All right, let me share the computer sound and the screen. And here we go. Hello, my name is David Brinkman. I am a former chair of the Greater Piedmont chapter of the Explorers Club. During my 12 years in the club, I've led or participated in 5 archaeological projects with other Explorers Club members. 5 different chapters took part in this work. I'm going to briefly cover the highlights of several of these projects. Many of you will recognize fellow members and spot a couple of expedition flags. My officer role in the chapter began in 2009. Here we are at a local Meet the Explorers event with chapter members Jim Welch, Dr. Bill Vardarella, Jan Siegler, Dr. Jonathan Leader, and myself along with John Hodge. At this event, 8-year-old Andrea Robichaud and her 10-year-old sister Clover are pictured admiring Jan Siegler's insect collection. Not long after this event, I teamed up with Dr. Jonathan Leader to tackle a long-standing mystery and an incorrect historical marker in Columbia, South Carolina. The results would lead to archaeological proof of a lost Confederate bridge which was burned in 1865 to slow the Union Army's General William T. Sherman. Sherman's 30,000 men would eventually cross the Broad River and burn the city of Columbia. We also pinpointed Sherman's pontoon bridge crossing site. These locations, lost for over 100 years, marked the last significant skirmish of the American Civil War. Our work was featured on the PBS History Detectives show in 2009. At the filming of this show, young Andrea and Clover Robichaud and my son Jeremy are spotted among the different people that took part in the production. This trio would show up again 2 years later at the first dig of the Finding Granby project. The colonial town of Granby, South Carolina developed from the first backcountry settlement of South Carolina. In 1786, a thriving Granby was chosen to be the new state capital of South Carolina. At the last minute, however, the location was moved about 2 miles north on the other side of the Congaree River. The new city would be given the name Columbia. Granby would die out and would be gone within 30 years. 200 years later, its exact location was unknown. In 2012, the young trio of kids would dig a pit 5 feet deep and find a single tiny pottery piece from Granby. With the help of other Explorers Club members, we would center in on the remains of a 1780 Granby home site, which itself was on top of the home site of the area's first Indian trader. And beneath that, we found Native American artifacts that were as old as 10,000 years. In just a 1,500 square foot area, 8 years later, we have now found over 18,000 artifacts from these periods. In doing so, we have resurrected the forgotten town of Granby. 2 years into our Granby dig, a colonial plat was discovered, which gave a clue to the location of a British fort called Fort Congaree II. A unique elevation feature on the plat led us to a house just 1,000 feet north of our Granby dig site. Under the direction of the state archaeologist and explorer, Dr. Jonathan Leader, 22 Explorers Club members took on the task of finding the lost and forgotten fort. Just 2 hours into the dig, the archaeological feature of a palisade wall was found. Dr. Leader would make a smaller group of us work the entire summer to continue the dig and prove that, in fact, this was Fort Congaree II. How important was this find? Fort Congaree II had been built in 1748 to protect the early settlers from Indian attacks. In around 1753, the fort's commander, a young Peter Mercier, received an urgent message from Major George Washington. The Fort Congaree II men arrived just in time to help Washington build Fort Necessity. As the hastily built fort was finished, they were attacked by the French and Indians. Mercier was shot twice, but managed to continue the fight. A third shot finally killed him. All the Fort Congaree II men gave their lives that day to save the young George Washington. Fort Congaree II would fall into disrepair after the loss of its key men, but the site became the training ground of young men who would bring an end to the French-Indian War and then later become heroes of the American Revolution. 17 years after Mercier and his men gave their lives, these new heroes drove the British from South Carolina and into the hands of George Washington, who defeated them at Yorktown. Today, our discoveries have brought Fort Congaree II and its heroes back to life. Our findings have led to the creation of a fully immersive virtual reality version of the fort, which includes a barracks that displays three-dimensional images of our dig and our findings. 10 years of archaeological work has also brought forth our own explorer heroes. Based on her efforts in the dig, including Granby and Fort Congaree II, Greater Piedmont explorer Jan Siegler is our third best digger. Taking the top 2 awards is the sister duo of Andrea and Clover Robichaud. The young Robichauds began attending our chapter meetings when they were just 12 and 14 years old. They both became student members when they were 16. Clover graduated from high school 2 years early and completed college on a full scholarship. She was awarded an Explorers Club grant during that time and completed research work in the Philippines. Andrea Robichaud has recently submitted an Explorers Club application for a grant, as she also attends college now. Clover is completing postgraduate work in a TA position at the University of South Carolina. 7 decades separate the ages of our new heroes. These ladies are an example for us all to get out there and explore.
David, thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thanks, John.
I'm now going to share my screen, and my talk is Citizen Science and Backyard Astronomy. Stand by. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, very good. Okay, and my talk is just a brief overview of the heavens, citizen science, and backyard astronomy. And short little talk. As far as exploring locally, we explore the heavens locally from 5 private observatories that we actually built about an hour outside of Columbia. And you see the scopes, actually the roofs roll off, our telescopes are in the building, and we have a little bunk room or sleeping room on the side. And why do we go an hour from Columbia? This is a light pollution map, which you essentially see. The X in the center is a green spot where you see that there's not a whole lot of light pollution, but the lights of Columbia are where my mouse is pointing. And then you've got Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham area up to the north. So it's a sweet spot otherwise in a fairly light impacted area. And I always like to bring that up in talks because we all bear responsibility to try to preserve our night skies, our dark skies. It's an important resource. Okay. So what I want to talk about just briefly before I show you some pretty pictures is we talked about citizen science earlier in James Borton's presentation. There are amateur astronomers that are providing actually good research data to professionals. And I just want to outline this as well, because we live in an era where big telescopes are in high demand, and they're really difficult for astronomers to get time on. But with an army of trained amateurs with good equipment, there's a lot of contribution that can be made. And of course, such things as photometric observations of variable stars to understand the dynamics of these star systems. Some amateurs track asteroids, and they look at the photometry, the changes in light, brightness of those asteroids to information deducing the rotation rates of asteroids. Of course, we know that some amateur astronomers discover comets. They also discover asteroids and supernova. So that's quite common as well. And then there are amateur astronomers that are looking at stars, looking at transits where exoplanets will actually move in front of the star and the light drops off just a bit. They time these observations, they send them to professionals that actually use this data. Other amateurs will make spectroscopic observations of different objects and deduce the composition as well. And in the last several years, there's been a couple of amateur astronomers who have actually noticed impacts on Jupiter, where a small comet or asteroid entered Jupiter's atmosphere and left a big blotch in the atmosphere for several days. And also they've documented impacts on the moon. So we have amateurs doing lots of things. But what I want to show you tonight is just end up with sort of some pretty pictures and a sky tour. This is all from our observatory. These are all my pictures up. I've taken about an hour from Columbia. This is an object, the Crab Nebula. It was a supernova that exploded in 1054 AD. It was visible in the daytime. It was documented not only by Native Americans, but it was also documented by Chinese. And it was a very bright object. And there's a pulsar at the center. And there we go. I took this one out in my backyard, I'll have to say. It was Christmas Day. We had opened our presents. We were getting ready to cook lunch, and I took my solar telescope out, and there was a huge prominence, and it was beautiful enough that I went back out and got a souped up webcam and ran a video. And this is essentially a stacked image from a video of an incredible prominence. And you see the convective cells on the sun. Took this one this past summer, the Lagoon Nebula down in Sagittarius. You can actually see this in binoculars as a little small smudge. This is about a 2.5 hour exposure showing you a star cluster on the right. And this is an active star forming region of our Milky Way galaxy. Again, all taken from an amateur telescope, such. Those of you who have seen the Pillars of Creation, the famous Hubble picture, well, here's John's image of the Pillars of Creation. Right in the center of the Eagle Nebula, you see these gas towers, and Hubble had made those images, those towers very famous. Again, an active star forming region. You see a number of globules where they're protostars. They're actually being formed at this time. Took this one last winter, a well-known galaxy up in the Big Dipper, a spiral galaxy, just to give you a perspective. Again, this is about a 3-hour exposure of a distant galaxy. And here's a barred spiral galaxy as well, showing you sort of an interesting dynamics. This again is about an 1.5 hour exposure of a galaxy in the constellation Fornax. And then, of course, everybody knows about the International Space Station. Actually, my wife Sharon and I were out walking last night and had a beautiful passage right over Columbia. We saw it. This is not a dramatization or an artistic view. This is a real photograph of the International Space Station. But guess what? I caught it flying right over my backyard in 2018. And it took about a half a second to cross in front of the sun. And that's a sun with no sunspots visible. And look, you can see, as one of my friends likes to call it, look, you can see Starfleet Command right, right on the sun. And in the video, it was quite amazing to see that very quickly went by. I didn't actually see it in real time. I had to go back and play the video. And this is one frame from that video of the International Space Station. Of course, we had a total eclipse of the sun that was visible in this area back in 2017. I took this with a robotic, with my computer running and a robotic system that I set up so I could yell and hoot and holler like a tourist, so to speak, watching the eclipse. And actually, Mark Brian Brown from the Explorers Club was present. And if he's on tonight, he probably remembers this picture, remembers this moment. So another celestial adventure. Now, I want to kind of put in a plug for Mars because it's very close to Earth, comparatively speaking. Every 2 years it gets close. Here's a small little picture I took just over about a month ago, actually. And you can see the ice cap to the upper, just toward the top. There's a round area that's an impact basin, and the dark zone down below, called Syrtis Major, is a volcanic field. So just want to kind of give you a sense of what you can actually see in a small scope. And if you've got access to a telescope, get out in the next, I would say, month or so, and you'll see some good detail on Mars because it's fairly close. And then this summer, we had a big surprise. This is actually from, my backyard, from my neighborhood. A bright comet appeared. This is just before dawn. Didn't need a telescope. You went out with your naked eye. There it was. Put a camera on a tripod, and there's Comet Neowise. So just give you a perspective of what's out there. And of course, this is a favorite. This is about a 2.5 hour exposure of the Dumbbell Nebula. This is where a star is given off basically its atmosphere, and it's kind of expanding out into space. Beautiful object, and you can see this in a small telescope, but you don't see the color because it's not that bright, but you can image the color. And of course, as explorers, we like to go to exotic places. I was lucky enough to travel down to Chile, to the Atacama, and there are objects in the southern hemisphere that we can't see here. I just want to put in a plug for an exotic trip. And I was able to, using a telescope there, to image the Carina Nebula and the Eta Carina star, which is a very unstable star down in Chile. And this again is about a 2.5 hour exposure to a telescope that I used down there. All right, well, that's about it. Now here's a picture of the observatory. You see one of the telescopes. I'm actually using a different one now, but that's just wanted to kind of end this evening with a celestial sky tour. And let me just say one more thing in closing, again, about relationships. I just want to relate one story, and then our presentation will conclude. Some years ago, I was involved in a flag expedition to bring up, we've actually located and recovered a World War II bomber that sunk in about 150 feet of water in a lake nearby in South Carolina. And Bob Siegler, one of our members, approached me, and he wanted to know if he could find it, who owned it. So we got to work on that. I ended up meeting with our then state archaeologist, was a gentleman named Dr. Bruce Ripito, and Bruce took a special interest in this project. And then we enlisted Bill Vardarella, another member. And lo and behold, after some years of searching, we found the aircraft. We were able to bring it up in 2005. Luckily for us, it was on the History Channel. If you want to go to iTunes for 99 cents, you can see the show about it. And then once we actually brought the aircraft out, we needed to build a saddle to put it on. And this is quite an adventure. The whole thing was quite an adventure. It took 2 weeks to get this thing off the bottom and onto the shore. But one of our other members, Dale Boozer, had a lumber company, and Dale sent us the supplies and tools and helped do this. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that we could have done this without the collaboration, the friendship, and the fellowship of some of our fellow explorers. And Bruce Ripito really helped us a lot, because in the beginning, it was Bob, Bill, and myself. We were 3 guys, and we had to convince the power company that we could successfully bring this up, because it was their lake. And Bruce sponsored a meeting at his office, and at some point, the power company came around. And so, but I will say the fellowship and the work that we had together, it really made that expedition successful. So thank you very much. Tim, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We've gone over, I know that, but really do appreciate your having us present this evening. And let's see here.
Great presentations by everyone. I definitely enjoyed them. We're running a little short on time here. I did have one question for Jenny, John, and Jonathan about security in Iraq. Did you ever have any security concerns for your own safety?
Frankly, no. And that's because I established a protocol a long time ago called simply, we don't do combat archaeology. I rely on a specific kind of bubble, and that is the bubble of local support. If you just are wealthy in an oil company and parachute in with a security team, not even parachute in, drive in with a big heavy security team, you might as well just paint targets on all your vehicles. In our case, we were invited guests. We were therefore under the invisible of every family that we worked with. And they were very clear. I was very clear with them. If our presence posed any threat to them whatsoever, it was time for us to not be there. And I've operated under those rules for a very long time. I will tell you, the most severe injury that I have ever sustained on an archaeological site was at Castle Pinckney, where I was beaten up by a little muddy velociraptor known as an oyster shell.
So, Anne, do we have any questions from our audience?
We do. I just wanted to say what an amazing chapter. What incredible presentations from China to Chernobyl to Iraq, Basra. Incredible, just absolutely incredible, to your backyard. So it couldn't be any more special. And you've incorporated your knowledge and you've spread it with all these young people as well, these young explorers. You shared so much of everything that you do with us and everyone around you. And you make us really proud. And oh my God, Tim, it is, we're watching sunset with you.
Yes, indeed. We just missed it, but.
Next time we'll all have to get drinks and be ready for it. But I'm going to start off with a question that Brad France had. And this one is for John Hodge. I still can't wrap my head around why stars appear to flicker while planets do not. It doesn't appear to be an issue of magnitude or brightness. Is it an issue of distance?
Well, basically the stars flicker because they're points of light that are passing through the atmosphere, and the planets typically have a very small angular size. In other words, you really can't perceive it with your eye, but Jupiter, if you look in binoculars as a disk, you can see that with Saturn. And so you've got something that's a little bit wider from an angular standpoint. So it creates the circumstance that the stars will appear to twinkle, but the planet, they're so distant, they're points of light, whereas the planets are disks, and they don't have quite the same phenomena. But I will say that you can, when they first come up, I've seen Venus rise many times just going through the atmosphere. When it's really low, you see it twinkling and scintillating and changing colors. Once it gets higher and further out of the atmosphere and up higher, Venus is quite steady. But the real reason, I think, is related to the physics of how the light comes from a distant point as a minor point of light versus the planets actually being small disks, if you will. I hope that answers the question.
I hope it does. The next one, here we go. This one is for Tim. Chris Runchak would like to say, has the radiation contributed to less than normal life expectancy or mortality for some of the animals that you've been studying?
Yeah, very good question. And for the animals that we've studied well enough, it certainly has. So for the birds and for the rodents, we know for sure that life expectancy is considerably shorter in the more radioactive areas. We're just starting to get a handle on the dogs. The dogs don't live very long either, but it's not clear whether that's simply from neglect and disease and predation versus radiation per se. But for the critters that we've documented well, absolutely, radiation shortens your life.
And what about the animals that have now come back into play into the area, the cats and other wild animals that hadn't been there before?
Yeah, that's another good question. And the truth is there are relatively few of them. There are so few of the lynx. There's only a couple of bear that have been seen. There's a handful of lynx that have moved in. And so it's not possible to do the sorts of long-term studies that are needed for a large mammal like that to determine the impacts of the radiation. Now there's a few more wolves out there, and there's actually quite a few more foxes. But again, it's incredibly difficult to do the long-term studies on those large mammals that you would need to do in a rigorous way to address that question. So much better to work with rodents, much better to work with insects, plants even provide a lot of insight. And for those organisms that we can actually observe well and experiment with, they're not doing so well in the radioactive areas.
Thank you. This one is for James. This is from Llewellyn Toulmin. In my experience in Vietnam, the military owned or controlled the powerful state-owned enterprises, especially in the telecoms, and were very difficult to deal with, or similar SOEs creating environmental difficulties.
That's a good question. But what we're seeing there in the kind of public-private enterprise development is that Hanoi, the gatekeeper for everything, understands and recognizes the looming environmental issues that they're facing. So we're seeing Western companies who are, if you wish, providing sustainability practices and conservation practices, as well as engineering principles that's going to help Vietnam address and mitigate some of these disasters that they have had related to water pollution. Everyone remembers a few years ago when the fish kill took place there in Ha Tien in central Vietnam, when a Taiwanese or Formosa plant just let its pipes open up, creating toxic waste going directly into the coastal waters. It was a huge disaster. And as a result of that, the government now, I think in terms of not so much prevention, but the idea that they're wanting to create kind of public-private partnerships where there might be, let's call it better sustainability practices and conservation at the same time. So we're seeing a movement, and this is really being driven by the young people. I think that the young people, they want to see tomorrow and the next day. And so there is a rising tide of environmentalism, and that is impacting on policy development, even in the Communist Party state.
I think we're seeing that all around from everyone's report here, how the young people are becoming involved much more than they used to be. And they really care about what's going on in their environment. It's their lives we're talking about at this point. And I'm really glad to see what's going on in this world. I have a question for you, Jenny. What would be the way you would put on a scarf so it would be an Iraqi type of scarf rather than an Iranian scarf?
Well, I can sort of demonstrate, but not really.
Because we have to be careful when we go abroad also. So we want to make sure.
Well, okay, no one will object to you wearing a scarf in any fashion you choose. And in fact, even in rural areas, I was often questioned, why are you wearing that? You're not Muslim. And I'd say, just out of deference to be polite. And they'd say, okay, so no one expects a non-Muslim to wear a scarf. However, I will sort of demonstrate for you. So you'll see this in Iranian film. Okay, it's very common for people to even have a bit of hair showing. Okay, and throw the scarf around this way, and it's sort of like that, almost like it would have been, I don't know, thrown on by Grace Kelly riding in a car, to protect her due. But if you were an Iraqi woman, first of all, you would have it so that it didn't show any hair. It would be turned like this, and there would be hijab pins to keep it snug and tight. Okay, now I don't do girly very well in any culture, so I certainly don't do this well. But the hijab pins would be here and here. And hijab pins are sort of like any jewelry. They tend to be passed down from mother to daughter. And whatever the scarf is made of is also a matter of various kinds of styles and fashions. We tend to see this blanket view of head coverings. They're just as attentive to fashion as any other article of clothing. And so just like we can sort of spot somebody and say that person's probably European, right? Even if we don't know exactly where, it's the same for them. Because they didn't expect to see Americans, we were often mistaken for either Turks or Iranians, because they knew we weren't Iraqi, but they couldn't figure out what the heck we were. But if you're going, just do whatever, it's fine.
So I'm seeing a really beautiful artifact behind you. Can you tell us what that is?
The chair?
Mm-hmm.
That is a set of saddlebags from Jordan. One of my first trips back in the early 90s. Everybody has a little shtick when they travel. And mine is wherever I go, I try to get on a horse. I even managed to do it once in central Moscow. There was a horse in the park. In Jordan, I did it by going out and meeting Bedouin. Bedouin, by the way, just means people who live out in the country in tents. It doesn't mean anything particular. And while I was riding around on horses, I saw one of those in a little local shop. And so we sat down and drank a lot of tea until it became mine. I use it actually in the back of it as the knitting. It hangs over the back of the knitting needles and stuff around.
Hey, those pockets are wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one is greetings to all from Princeton University Press. This is from Jenny. My question is as follows. Given the migratory nature of animals and the roaming of the dogs in the exclusion zone and red forest, is there a danger that there might be contamination of world wildlife in terms of mutations being passed on?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's one that's driven a lot of our interest over the years. The first grant we got from National Geographic actually was related to how much radioactivity is actually being carried by birds as they migrate out. They come into the zone, they feed for a while, they get their bodies contaminated, they got radioactive poop, and then they fly away and they drop that, and then of course they die elsewhere. And it turned out that there was enormous quantities of radioactivity being dispersed out of the zone, but it was trivial relative to the amount of radioactivity that was in Chernobyl already. And because it gets spread far and wide, everyone knows the solution to pollution is dilution, right? And so it's basically undetectable. But the genetic contamination through mutations, elevated mutations, that's a really significant issue, especially for some of these threatened and endangered species that are going through there. Why the heck would you introduce an endangered species into a highly mutagenic environment where their genome is going to be polluted and potentially spreading elsewhere? Now, of course, there's not many of these horses anywhere else in the world, so probably don't have to worry about it going too far. But the genetic load that's imposed by living in this mutagenic environment is significant. Every organism that's been tested rigorously shows some level of genetic damage as a result of the exposure. As for some of the critters, it's significant in terms of life history, longevity. For others, it isn't. And that's what we're hoping to explore a little more of.
Well, thank you. I guess I have a final question for all of you, and you have such a wonderfully cohesive chapter. This is for all of you to sign off on before we end this evening. You're all working in your backyards to some extent. Maybe you can tell us what you have going on next or what you're all going to be working on for the future, since we're really not traveling that far. Are you working together on some other project right now? Go ahead, take it, John.
Well, we are. Several of us are working on Castle Pinckney. Because I'm the state archaeologist, I work from one corner of the state to the other. We have prehistoric canoes that we're working on. We have villages we're working on. We collaborate heavily on the Native American reservations with the Catawba and others. As David pointed out, a lot of his projects pull all of us together. David's a magnet. He's very good at that. So is John Hodge. Everybody in this group. It's sort of like a bunch of kids get together and someone opens up their toy box and someone says, wow, what's in the toy box today? And everybody goes, I don't know, let's go play. We go play. It's a little bit more serious than that. But the main thing is the relationships. The exploration drives us, the need to know, the wish to discover drives us, but it drives us as a group and it drives us for the greater good. It doesn't drive us for narcissism. It doesn't drive us to, dance in the spotlight. It drives us as a group to protect our past, make a way for the future, and make sure that all members of our community, regardless of where they come from, indigenous, majority, margin, whatever, that we all play together on an equal field so that we can discover together and progress.
The camaraderie is just exceptional. David, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I'm continuing. There's that covered bridge you see behind us and trying to recreate that. It's definitely the first curvilinear bridge in the world that was built here in 1796. California claims to have the first one, but that was built in the early 1900s. And it may have potentially been the first covered bridge in America. So we're kind of working on that. And then there's also some preservation work, that Fort Congaree too, and the Granby site. And we were just talking to people from the city of Casey where this is at. And we're concerned because there's a quarry that wants to expand. That quarry has already dug a 400-foot deep hole that has wiped out half of the Granby area. And they would like to expand that. So there's some preservation possibilities, and there's lots of people in our group and the Explorers Club that know how to do stuff like that. So
I think at the end of the presentation, there's going to be a page up with all of your contacts, and I think you're going to get a lot of people that are going to say, "Hey, can I come down there and join you?" Because you've been so inviting to everyone. Jenny, you wanted to say something?
Oh, did I? Well, I can if you want me to.
Sure.
I will continue to try to drag the twin Johns into my projects. I am actually slated to retire in July, which means I'll finally have time to get some work done. All the academics around me are laughing because they know exactly what I mean. We've bought a little mountain place in the Apuan Alps in Italy. That sounds far classier than it is. But I'm hoping with the basis in Italy, it'll actually be easier for me to continue to work in Iraq. Many of my colleagues that work in Iraq with me are Italian. The Italians were kind of first on the ground. And Tim, I still haven't dragged you down there yet. There's a lot of concern about exactly the stuff you investigate with depleted uranium munitions. There's a lot of hotspots out there and people worried about their wildlife.
I'd love to get down there. We almost made it a few years ago, almost a decade ago, I guess. But the place goes up and down in terms of its ease of access, as it were. But I'd love to get there sometime.
John Fisher, do you have anything to add as far as what you're going to be doing next or what you're working on, or?
Well, like John said, we're still doing Castle Pinckney. Wasn't ever excavated, so luckily us and USC, Jenny, hopefully as well, and University College London will be doing that every year. And we've got some really big news about that coming up. So hopefully that'll be out in the next few months or a year or so.
Okay, so you're going to have to share that with us as soon as it comes through. Okay, James, what about you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you again and National for hosting this program and inviting us. And we really, we had a very exciting program this evening because we've gone locally right here in our backyard in Columbia, South Carolina to Iraq and Russia, Kazakhstan, Vietnam. It seems to me that John Hodge spoke to the point very clearly and very poignantly. He says that, this is about fellowship, and we are all explorers. We are looking outside of ourselves. Some of us, all of us are writers and communicators. So I must admit that I've sort of developed a bunker mentality because I have a book in progress that focuses on the South China Sea. But fortunately, as part of this outlook and fellowship, I have been reaching out to marine biologists, and I'm proud to say they let me stand on their shoulders so I can get a better look at the seascape in the South China Sea. But just last week, we had a webinar that was inviting 5 marine biologists. That is the East-West Center hosted that webinar in Washington. But we invited 5 marine biologists from Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, U.S., Miami, John McManus, all of us converging together through this new technology to examine a very pressing issue about what is happening to the coral reefs in the South China Sea at the hands of China and their militarization of some of those atolls and rocks and islands, if you wish. So am I reaching out to our own community right here in our backyard? Absolutely, because I used to teach at Coastal Carolina. Jay Pickney is here at USC. It's all part of this kind of collective, if you wish, brain trust. I think we have an exceptional chapter, and I'm really happy that we had this opportunity to share it with, the world. So thank you.
I think you have an exceptional chapter also. It's just unbelievable. And John, you put this together beautifully. Thank you so much. I actually twisted John's arm the other day and I said, for his amateur astronomy, maybe we can be a part of something one of these days. And what did you say back to me, John?
We're going to do it. We have to figure out something where people can actually see something interesting, something unique. So we're going to work on that for sure. Absolutely.
We all want to be able to take those pictures that you do. So they were stunning. They were just absolutely beautiful. Is there anybody, Tim? Is there anyone else that I didn't get to?
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm actually learning some new software for photometry. So I've got a pretty ambitious plan once I can master the software, and that's a lot of it. The telescope is willing, and the skills there are willing. It's trying to actually do the data reduction that is the next phase. So I'm learning a new software is oftentimes kind of the steep part of the learning curve, should we say, that process. But that's my incoming thing.
Do we have a slide to share with everybody for contacts or no?
We don't, but we'll get that out. We'll get something.
So we'll put that up on our website so that people can contact you whenever they. I'm sure because there's going to be quite a few questions when people see this show. And, as far as people watching from all over the world, they come in and they tune in at different times. This is archived, so they'll be able to see it. Just tonight, we have people from Portugal, South Africa, South America watching with you. So it couldn't be just more of an impressive chapter. Tim Radke, thank you so much for your comments at the beginning. And take it away. Tell us what we have going on for next week.
Well, first, I just want to thank everyone for sharing your stories with all of us in the Explorers Club. I mean, it's a very fascinating segment. Next Monday, there's no lecture on Monday because it's a holiday. Next Thursday, we will be doing Chapter Connect. It will be David Dolan in the Southern California chapter, our sister chapter here in the south of California. So I'm looking forward to their presentations.
So I just want to say thank you to everyone, all of our presenters tonight. You were just amazing. And I think that there's going to be a Field Raven speaker series coming up on Wednesday as well. And then straight back to Southern California next Thursday. It was an absolute pleasure and an honor to meet all of you. And I'm just thrilled to learn about everything that you're doing. And I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to meeting you sometime soon in the future. And I'm going to come down to South Carolina with my shovel real soon. So stay well, everybody.
Come on down, Ann. Come on down.
It would be a thrill. Anyway, thank you for your involvement. Thank you for everything that you do, and relationships really make a difference.
Thank you,
Thanks
Ann.
again. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.